Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to CNS at 30, our special symposium to commemorate the Society's 30th anniversary. My name is Patricia Reuter-Lorenz, and along with my symposium co-organizer, Ron Mangan, we've enjoyed supporting and participating in CNS since its founding. For many of us old-timers, it's hard to believe that it's really already been 30 years. But no matter how old they make you feel, anniversaries are a time to celebrate. So we hope you'll be joining us for tonight's dance party and for the special appearance of Pavlov's dogs. An anniversary is also an occasion to take stock of where we've come from, where we are now, and where we might be headed, which is the spirit of today's symposium. But first, even though we're running a little behind, I want to take a little trip with you down memory lane. I'm sure to many of you, cognitive neuroscience seems like such an essential discipline that it's hard to imagine when it didn't exist. To the contrary, many of us remember when the science that we were doing didn't have a name. The birth of cognitive neuroscience changed all of that. An interdisciplinary field uniting psychology, the neurosciences, computation, and even philosophy, with the shared goal of understanding how the human mind works. Indeed, the founding of cognitive neuroscience was intentional and carefully executed. Its name arose in the late 1970s in that legendary cab ride on the Upper East Side, shared by George Miller and Mike Gazzaniga. Then came several major initiatives launched by visionary leaders, including Mike Gazzaniga, Mike Posner, Steve Coslin, and others, with the generous support of the Sloan, James S. McDonald Foundation, and the Pew Foundation. These initiatives included a small grants program for individual investigators and funded centers for cognitive neuroscience at universities and institutions across the US, Canada, and Europe. Another crucial element was establishing a dedicated publication venue, the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. The first issue was published in 1989, and 35 volumes later, the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience continues to be our field's flagship journal. Thanks to our excellent science, our long-standing partnership with MIT Press, and the leadership of the founding editor, Mike Gazzaniga, followed by Mark D'Esposito, who served for 17 years, and the journal's newest editor, Brad Postal. But arguably, one of the most crucial elements of the field's founding was Brain Camp. This fabulous, intensive 2-week summer institute has educated generations of cognitive neuroscientists, fostered lifelong friendships, and spawned many new collaborations. First known as the McDonald Summer Institute in Cognitive Neuroscience, the inaugural meeting took place at Harvard in 1988. Then Mike Gazzaniga turned the Summer Institute into the iconic program it has become, holding it at Dartmouth College, UC Davis, and then Santa Barbara. Of course, every 5 years, there's been the Tahoe Summer Institute, which produced the many volumes of the cognitive neurosciences. Tremendous thanks to the McDonald, Pew, and Kavli Foundations, and especially NIMH and NIDA for their generous support over the many years. But nevertheless, it took only a few institute cohorts to realize the overwhelming enthusiasm for the new field of cognitive neuroscience. The need for a professional organization and annual meeting were undeniable. And with that realization, the Cognitive Neuroscience Society was born. Our first meeting was held in 1994 at the Fairmont Hotel here in San Francisco, a venue that we rapidly outgrew. And here we are, 30 meetings later, running late, but still growing strong. Of course, the Society is our membership, and we're grateful for your attendance, for your sharing your best research, and for making the new discoveries that move our field forward. We also owe a debt of gratitude to Kate Trethewey, Tara Miller, and her team, and the way the meetings have been organized for many years, our program committee for this year's symposium, the symposium committee, the poster and awards committees. Just thank you for your support. So now let's turn to our symposium. This symposium will reflect on our scientific roots, highlight the state of the art of cognitive neuroscience research, and forecast some future directions for our field. We're very fortunate today to have some of our own field's luminaries speaking with us. Dan Schacter and Marlene Berman have each been recognized by the Society's Fred Kavli Award for Distinguished Career Contributions in Cognitive Neuroscience. And Nicholas Turk-Brown and Adriana Galvin have each been recognized for their outstanding early career contributions to cognitive neuroscience with the Young Investigators Award. We're grateful and honored that they've agreed to talk about their research and to share their perspectives on the fields. Okay, so our first talk is going to be given by Dan Schacter, the William R. Keene Jr. Professor at Harvard. Among many other contributions and accolades, Dan is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, was on the CNS founding committee, and has been a long-time member of the governing board. And the title of his talk, which will be up soon, is On the Emergence of Cognitive Neuroscience, Memory Research as a Case Study.
All right, thank you, Patty, for inviting me to participate in this very timely, important symposium. It is hard to believe it's been 30 years. I was at that first meeting, and it is mind-boggling to think that we're celebrating a 30th anniversary. I guess not as mind-boggling to be struggling with PowerPoint, still 30 years on. It does happen. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit, I'm very much part of the past part of this symposium. I'm going to give a very condensed historical overview of some developments in memory research that I think reflect more broadly on the emergence of cognitive neuroscience as a field, and I'm using memory research as a case study. In the title, I'll be talking about some work I've been involved in and also more broadly about other kinds of work. But I think when we're talking about the history of memory research, we need to at least briefly go all the way back to the 1880s. It constituted a critical decade in the history of memory research. Everybody knows about Hermann Ebbinghaus and his studies of himself back in 1885, the groundbreaking volume of memory, titled Memory, that contained the first systematic experimental analysis, all kinds of interesting findings, the forgetting curve, and so forth. So that was kind of what we might in retrospect call a cognitive experimental, cognitive behavioral approach. Possibly less well known to some is that in that same decade, and that's why I think it was such a critical decade, Théodule Ribot, the French psychologist, published 3 years before Ebbinghaus his volume on diseases of memory, which brought together as kind of a compendium of all the clinical cases of memory disorders following brain damage that he was able to pull together in the literature. Not only was it a compendium of cases, he also articulated, I thought in a very clear way, and in a way that foretold later developments, how studying memory breakdowns after brain damage could inform basic understanding of normal memory function. So he said, if in the normal condition of the organism, the different forms of memory are independent, then it's natural that if in a morbid state of brain damage, one disappears, the other should remain intact, kind of the logic of neuropsychological inference that we're all familiar with, that's driven a lot of work in our field, and Ribot had it back in 1882. However, if you track what happened after these two groundbreaking developments in the 1880s, with very few exceptions, I would argue, having studied this somewhat, that the experimental cognitive approach pioneered by Ebbinghaus and the brain-oriented neuropsychological approach pioneered by Semon proceeded largely on parallel tracks. And there was a literature in both areas, fairly substantial, a lot of it in German, but they proceeded largely on parallel tracks. I'll say one exception comes from the work of someone who I've written about quite a bit, a German biologist by the name of Richard Semon, who published 2 books in 1904 and 1909, where he proposed the notion of the engram as a biological substrate of memory, and tried in these books to link mnemonic phenomena at psychological and biological levels. Semon's work was largely unrecognized for decades after that work was published. More recently, he has come into the recognition that I think he deserves. Sheena Jocelyn and her colleagues published a really nice article, Journal of Neuroscience, 2014, that they call Heroes of the Engram, where they mention Semon, as well as some other people who I have to at least mention by name in a talk like this: Hebb, Penfield, Lashley, James McConnell, Richard Thompson. I won't have time to say more about them, but I do want to say more about another one of the heroes of the Engram in this Jocelyn et al. Article, and that, of course, is the amazing Brenda Milner, still going strong at 104 years of age, turning 105 in July, I believe. We all know about her pioneering work with Scoville on the patient HM and characterizing a novel, then novel amnesic deficit after medial temporal lobe removal. And I would argue that this is one of two developments in the 1950s that propelled the subsequent development of cognitive neuroscience. The other one, we heard about the famous taxi ride in George Miller. I would go back to Miller's magic number 7 plus or minus 2 paper, which was focused on short-term memory and led to a dramatic explosion of research in the cognitive psychology of short-term memory. But I'd also try to argue that with only a few exceptions, and there were exceptions, particularly in work on the relationship between short-term and long-term memory, but with very few exceptions, cognitive and neuropsychological or neuroscientific approaches to memory proceeded largely in parallel for most of the next 25 years. Okay, now I want to move up to October 1979 and talk about a conference that probably relatively few people here know about. Some of you may know about it. It was organized by the late Laird Cermak, who was, of course, a neuropsychologist at the Boston VA Hospital, published a lot of important work on characterizing the amnesic syndrome. And he organized a conference on human memory and amnesia at the beautiful Lake Maury Inn in Vermont in an attempt to build bridges between cognitive psychology and neuropsychology, neuroscience / approaches to memory. And that conference had a lot of luminaries in the field, sort of a who's who list of both cognitive psychologists and neuropsychology and neuroscience, with two exceptions. I put a yellow asterisk next to the names of Neil Cohn and myself. We were lowly graduate students at the time, not luminaries, and we were brought to this conference, fortunately, by our advisors, Neil Cohn by Larry Squire, myself by Endel Tolving, and so we got to sit in with all these big names. And it was an amazing conference, a lot of discussion and interchange, not only of specific phenomena, but how could we move the field forward in a way that increased interaction between the cognitive psychologist and the neuropsychologist and neuroscientist. Laird Cermak asked us to write book chapters. There was a book, some of you may know it, edited volume, Human Memory and Amnesia, came out in 1982. And I'll just quote from Laird's preface, which I think was again, prophetic. He said, there, during the height of New England's annual foliage demonstration, a cross-fertilization was begun that promised to eventuate in as bright a future of interdiscipline interaction as the environment itself. And I think Laird was largely shown to be correct there. Laird didn't mention the golf match in which I took on him, Endel Tolving, and Morris Moscovich and beat them all on their best ball. And then Endel insisted that we go out the next day, and then I give them one stroke on their best ball because it wasn't fair. And we played to a draw that day. In any case, going forward, the topic of dissociable forms of memory was one of the main focal points of discussion at the conference. And it subsequently became an issue of intense common interest that generated a lot of crosstalk among cognitive psychologists, neuropsychologists, and neuroscience. And I would argue that this was very important in developing a cognitive neuroscience of memory. Now, this focus on dissociable forms of memory by 1979 was not novel. We already knew, for example, from the work of Sue Corkin with HM, with Brenda Milner, some of it, that HM, despite his severe deficit in remembering his experiences could nonetheless show normal acquisition of motor skills. What was this? Was this some oddity of motor skill learning or something broader? We also knew about the really fascinating, important work from Warrington and Weisskranz in England, showing that when you gave severely amnesic patients certain kinds of memory tests, they could seemingly paradoxically exhibit robust and even normal memory. For example, if they saw a list of words including porch, they could later identify the word porch with less help from a fragmented version of it than if they had not seen the word before. What did this mean? There were various interpretations of it. So there was this background, and we were discussing a lot of those things at that conference. And then I think moving forward, what we saw is a deeper exploration into some of these issues. So, for example, coming out of Larry Squire's lab, there was the important science paper in 1980, Cohn and Squire, where they showed that amnesic patients' learning of new skills was not restricted to the motor domain, but extended to the interesting case of reading mirror-inverted script using some techniques that had been developed by the cognitive psychologist Paul Kohlers at Toronto. That was one important development out of the Squire lab. Then in some collaborative work with Peter Graff and George Mandler, they were able to really clear up what was going on with Warrington and Weisskranz phenomenon, showing that there were conditions under which amnesic patients could exhibit normal, relatively normal memory following a study of a word list if you gave them a three-letter word beginning and just asked them to write down the first word that popped to mind, as most of us know. If you gave them that same cue and asked them to think back to the study episode, remember that episode, they would exhibit impairment. So we're starting to get a good handle on some of these issues that were known but hadn't really been explored. Meanwhile, on the cognitive side, there were also developments on this dissociable forms of memory idea. So Larry Jacoby and Mark Dalish published in a very important paper in 1981, JEP General, showing that levels of processing manipulations that we knew from a decade of research had very strong effects on standard recognition memory tests had little or no effect on identifying a briefly flash word, and the priming effect that occurred as a result of prior exposure occurred seemingly independently of prior study manipulations. It was a pretty shocking observation at the time. Tolving, myself, and Heather Stark were really interested in some of this work coming out of the Warrington and Weisskranz lane, and we devised a study of word fragment completion priming in normal subjects, trying to see, could we see an analogous dissociation to what had been observed in amnesics. And I'm a little hesitant to present a 40-year-old slide here, but it still exists, data still exists, and one of the most interesting findings from that study was that while recognition memory from 1 hour to 1 week, of course, declined, as Ebbinghaus would have expected, the priming effect on a fragment completion test, so having studied a word, you're now given incomplete fragments and you're trying to identify the word, you get a big boost from prior study, but the magnitude of that boost did not change between 1 hour and 7 days. We thought that was pretty cool at the time. Little did we know that David Mitchell, years later, would track down subjects who had been in one of his priming studies 17 years later, when undergraduates were now 40 years old, and he found evidence of preserved priming over 17 years with both pictures and words. While all of these dissociations were generating a lot of discussion, how do we think about these phenomena? What's the best way of theoretically conceptualizing them? Some people were focusing on the idea that there were multiple memory systems involved, separate memory systems for procedural learning, for priming versus standard old recall and recognition. Other people were saying, no, we should think about that think about those dissociations as reflecting different measures operating within fundamentally the same system. Then in 1985, Peter Graff and I published some work on new work on amnesic patients, and it was there that we introduced the distinction between implicit and explicit memory, and the idea there was that we wanted to use descriptive terms to try to capture the key elements of what was going on in these two areas of study: explicit memory reflecting conscious recollection of a past experience, implicit reflecting non-conscious effects of prior exposure on past experience. So going forward, that and the similar distinction from Squire, declarative and non-declarative memory, help to organize the literature without necessarily requiring someone to make a commitment to one point of view or the other. Meanwhile, cognitive neuroscience is starting to emerge as a topic in the field. So in 1984, Mike Gazzaniga edits the Handbook of Cognitive Neuroscience. I didn't put Mike's picture up there because everybody knows what he looks like, and he's sitting right there. He doesn't need a picture. As far as I know, this is the first time the term cognitive neuroscience appears in a book title. Mike can tell me that I'm wrong, but I wonder if there is an earlier example of that. So it's really in the air now in 1984. In 1986, Joe Ledoux and Bill Hurst put together an interesting volume, Mind and Brain Dialogues in Cognitive Neuroscience. They paired up a cognitive psychologist and a neuroscientist on a variety of topics. I wrote the cognitive chapter on memory. I was paired up with Mike Gabriel from the University of Illinois. We went back and forth and had some interesting exchanges on how could we most productively move forward. Well, now there are other developments in the 1980s that are obviously crucial. The field-changing PET study from Peterson, Fox, Posner, Minton, and Rakel, published in 1989, showed that now we could use functional neuroimaging to study cognitive processes. That really obviously set in motion a lot of important things in our field related to experimental design and linking up brain and mind that I don't need to elaborate on. And as Patty mentioned, in 1989, JCON published its first issue. So things are really starting to move now. We get the first PET evidence of activation of the hippocampus in normal humans from a study by Squire et al. In 1992. So one of the points I want to make out of this is that many of the issues that were discussed among 1980s, early 90s memory researchers who attempted to bridge cognitive and neural levels of analysis were what I would call where questions, where issues regarding brain regions linked to particular forms of memory. Is the hippocampus, for example, selectively involved in explicit, declarative, or spatial memory on the one hand versus implicit, non-declarative, or non-spatial memory on the other? What about recollection versus familiarity? We're all familiar with the literature on these topics. What cortical or subcortical regions observe priming or procedural learning? What role does prefrontal cortex play in episodic encoding and retrieval? And I would argue that these kinds of where questions were very well suited to study with PET and fMRI neuroimaging, of course, in conjunction with cognitively well-informed paradigms and concepts. So I think all that coming together was one of the reasons why the field started to advance pretty rapidly. One nice example of this comes from the early Toronto PET studies of encoding and retrieval. Tulving, Craik, Moscovich, and others were using PET now, pairing it up with well-defined cognitive paradigms, cognitive constructs derived from earlier research in cognitive psychology, and reporting some interesting differences between left and right frontal lobe activation during encoding and retrieval. So by the time of the first CNS meeting, which I guess was 94, not 93, the field was, I think, was poised to incorporate functional neuroimaging into studies focused on distinguishing among forms and processes that comprise memory and related questions that have fueled the development of memory research over the past 30 years. The advent of event-related fMRI later in the 90s, I think, accelerated the development of this research by not only providing greater flexibility in experimental design. Some of us remember when you had to really just do violence to your cognitive paradigm to make it fit a block design in PET or fMRI. That was no longer necessary. And also allowing researchers to link changes in bold activity to subjective aspects of memory by sorting brain activity based on subjective response. There are probably nowadays hundreds of examples of this. I think one nice one came from Eldridge et al., their Nature Neuroscience 2000 paper, where they paired up an event-related fMRI study with the Remember No technique developed by Tulving, where following study of a list of words, in addition to asking people whether they recognize the word as being old from the list or new, you would have them make a judgment. Do you remember specific details about the prior occurrence? Do you just know it happened? Is it just familiar to you? They asked whether hippocampal activity during retrieval specifically was related to our responses, and indeed they provided evidence that that was so. So all of these developments, I think, then led to the kind of taxonomies that we're all familiar with. I took this from Ward's 2020 textbook. Mangan and Gazzaniga have a similar taxonomy where we might disagree on some of the details of this, but if you squint a little bit, probably most people will say, yeah, as a first approximation to different kinds of memory, that's at least acceptable, if not a final answer. And I think that came out of all those lines of research, some of which were inspired by that Lake Maury conference. Okay, my last 5 minutes, I want to try to make a brief case that now something similar has happened in the tradition of research related to the pioneering early work of Sir Frederick Bartlett. So as we know, Bartlett, in his famous 1932 book, reported all kinds of interesting memory distortions that people made when they remembered stories, led to his famous conclusion that memory appears to be an affair of construction rather than reproduction. Bartlett's work was ignored for a while, but cognitive psychologists picked it up in the 60s and 70s, and they published numerous studies on constructive aspects of memory during that time. But there was very little going on in neuropsychology or neuroscience from this constructive perspective. That was pretty much, if not purely, largely a cognitive enterprise, but that began to change in the 1990s. So what happened? Well, I think one important development was the advent of the source monitoring framework introduced by Marcia Johnson and her colleagues in an important Psych Bulletin paper in 1993. This incorporated cognitive data and theory as well as neuropsychological observations on a variety of patient populations and got people thinking about more constructive aspects of memory in relation to brain activity. Neuropsychological studies were starting to reveal some very striking memory distortions. So work from Alan Parkin from my lab reported extremely high, pathologically high levels of false alarms in patients with specific kinds of frontal lobe damage that in both of those papers we tried to relate to cognitive constructs regarding constructive memory. There was some very interesting work on confabulation in brain-damaged amnesic patients coming from Armin Schmitter and his colleagues from Morris Moscovich that was linking up some very interesting cognitive constructs with evidence of florid memory distortion in these patients. Mika Verfai and I began on a series of studies of memory illusions in amnesic patients. So we're starting to see the emergence of more, at least neuropsychologically oriented work on constructive memory. Another important development from a paradigmatic point of view was the advent of the paradigm I'm sure we're all familiar with, the false recall and recognition of semantic associates paradigm that Roddy Roediger and Kathleen McDermott published on in 1995, where they rediscovered and expanded on earlier work by Deese. I assume that most people are familiar with this paradigm. You can read what's going on the slide. The point I want to make is that this gave people with a cognitive neuroscience orientation a way of reliably inducing a particular kind of robust false memory, for example, in the fMRI scanner. So now you could go in and start asking questions about brain activity related to true and false memories. And so neuroimaging and ERP studies use this procedure to examine neural correlates of true versus false memories. My lab was involved in this. We did work with PET, with Tim Curran, Eric Ryman, with Randy Buckner, event-related fMRI, a collaboration with Marcia Johnson looking at some ERK correlates. So by 1998, Wilma Kutztal, Ken Norman, and I were able to write an annual review of psychology article on the emerging cognitive neuroscience of constructive memory. There was enough activity over the previous decade for us to try to put forth some ideas related to Marcia Johnson's earlier work. Going forward a decade, Donna Addis and I extended this cognitive neuroscience of constructive memory concept to how we think about the role of memory in imagining the future. The idea that some of these constructive aspects of memory that result in memory distortion might actually be good things if you're trying to use memory in a flexible way to imagine novel future events. And we and others showed striking similarities in brain activity when people were asked to remember past experiences and imagine future experiences. This is from our paper in 2007 showing default network midline regions showing that common activation, and others did as well. Kathleen McDermott's lab with Carl Spooner published some related work. And in that same year of 2007, we had important work from Eleanor McGuire and Demis Hassabis showing that amnesic patients, their amnesic patients at least, have difficulty imagining novel scenes, led to their important construct of scene construction. Randy Buckner and Carol published a very nice integrative article on self-projection and the brain, and that work has really moved forward over the last 15 years, again, extending this notion of cognitive neuroscience of constructive memory. And I'll just conclude by briefly mentioning two other related developments. One is the body of work on reconsolidation that came out of the early study with non-human animals from Joe Ledoux's lab, led by Karim Nader. And Nader and his colleagues, as this work evolved, extended the concept of reconsolidation, linked it up with the cognitive constructs going back to Bartlett about how memory can change as a consequence of retrieval, and reconsolidation perhaps giving a neural underpinning to that. So again, an expansion on this notion of cognitive neuroscience of constructive memory. And my last slide, or second to last slide I'll show, is another important annual review paper from Morris Moscovich, Lynn Nadell, Roberto Cabiza, and Gordon Winokur on their work on how episodic memory transforms over time with relation to what's going on in the hippocampus and the neocortex, again, filling in an important piece of the puzzle, and I think ultimately giving us a lot of insight into again, these early ideas of Bartlett, his famous quote here, another one of his famous quotes, that remembering is not the re-excitation of fixed, lifeless, and fragmentary traces. It's an imaginative reconstruction or construction. I think a lot of this work in cognitive neuroscience has helped to enrich our understanding of this fundamental insight. Okay, thank you for your attention.